Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Head to Head, or Head to Heads. In this case, this evening, I've got two excellent guests with me who are going to discuss not only the latest election results in the UK, but also the future of politics and where it goes from here. So, first and foremost, let me introduce the venerable guests who are going to share their wisdom with us tonight. I'd like to start off by introducing Roger Helmer, veteran, and I hope he doesn't mind the use of the word. I mean it in the nicest sense of the word.
Fair comment.
Politician and commentator. Good evening, Roger.
Hi, Bill. Good to see you again.
And David Maddox, political journalist extraordinaire, if I may say so, and a man with a lot of interesting insights who will share with us tonight. So, hi, David.
Hi, Bill. Hi, Roger.
Hi.
Right then, let's crack straight into it. That's a very interesting time for those of us who are certainly politics nerds like us here, and I hope you viewers. We've got election results coming in any time soon. There have been major local elections around the United Kingdom, and we're looking at the future of the London Mayoralty, once held by Ken Livingstone, once held by someone called Boris Johnson, and currently held by someone called Sadiq Khan. However, he has many challengers, including the notable Laurence Fox and many others, including UKIP and it seems dozens of other parties. There's also been local elections around the country and mayoralties in the Midlands and the north of England that I think we should spend some time on. So I'll set the ball rolling with David, because I know, David, you recently interviewed one of the main players in the London mayoralty election, Mr. Laurence Fox. And that was a very interesting interview. So what's your take, first of all, on where we're heading to on this election result today? What's going to happen? Is Sadiq Khan about to be toppled?
Sadly not. If only. Well, I mean, given his record as London Mayor, he should be desperately trying to hold on with his fingernails. I mean, it's been an appalling one. And the great pity of this election for me is that there's not been a serious challenge to him. There's just been an acceptance from the Conservatives that London is a Labour city. They've got a weak candidate. I like him personally. He's a nice chap, Shaun Bailey, but they've got a weak candidate who had no support and no help. And it was a rather surprising selection process, let's put it like that. And, you know, the challenges to Sadiq have come really from people like Laurence Fox, and that's largely been it. I mean, there seem to be dozens of candidates. I mean, I lost count of how many candidates there were, but I mean, although I have to say I have a great deal of time for UKIP's Peter Gammons. I think he's a good man. He deserved more attention. I've actually had some very interesting ideas as well. But I think the key to winning London is, in fact, really the kind of Boris Johnson model, if you like. You need a big personality. You don't necessarily need a political party behind you, although it helps a lot. But you need a big personality. You need to be somebody that Londoners can connect to and see and identify with. And that's why I think Laurence, had he given himself more time, would have been a much more, may well have had a good run at this, actually. He unfortunately only gave himself a couple of months. But, I mean, Sadiq's going to win easily. Let's be honest.
Well, let's get Roger's view on this before we dissect it. We're talking about big personalities. Of course, Lord Buckethead is quite a big personality in this election race. So I'm personally hoping, of course, alongside Dr. Gammons and all of the other contestants, including Laurence Fox and so on, that I hope they give him a good run. But do you share, Roger, David's feeling of inevitability about the return of Sadiq Khan?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Bill, but I'm afraid I do. It's as near to a dead cert, I think, as you get in politics. And it is fairly astonishing because on any realistic criteria or objective criteria, he's actually done a rotten job. People always talk about knife crime in the capital, but he's made a mess of transport, and he's done a whole load of things that don't make any sense. So an impartial observer standing back and seeing what's going on would say, well, he's got no chance. And yet we know not only that he has a chance, but that he's almost a dead cert. And I see a curious parallel there with, I'm sure we're going to talk about Scotland at some point, but if you look at Nicola Sturgeon, you could say almost the same. You can make a list of the failures of policy, whether it's drugs, suicide rates, whether it's the rollout of the vaccine, whether it's education in Scotland. Again and again, she has done really terribly badly. And yet, like Sadiq Khan in London, she seems pretty much unstoppable. So the strange thing is, I think that we're facing a sort of inflection point in British politics, because for a long time, going back 2 or 3 decades, people voted as their parents voted. They voted according to their demographic and their class. So you could be fairly confident in predicting what outcomes were going to be. Now that seems to be changing enormously. People now are concerned about, well, of course, we know they're concerned about identity politics, but you have this curious reversal that London, which used to vote Conservative because it was the city of business, it was the city of finance, it was that sort of city, is now in thrall to Sadiq Khan. Whereas if you look at the Red Wall, I don't want to overgeneralize here, but I think many of the Red Wall voters are what I would regard as people with traditional values, and they are attracted to the Conservatives. Whereas in London, you've got an awful lot of people with what we loosely describe as metropolitan values. I hesitate to use the word woke, but there's a lot of wokeness, I think, in London, which of course works in Sadiq's favour. And we mentioned Laurence Fox several times. I think his problem is that he is anti-woke, he's anti-political correctness. So the one place he shouldn't really be standing is London, because although there will be a small minority of people who support him, and if I were in London, I might be strongly inclined to vote for him, I think it's just not a world view that is going to win London for him, which is a shame.
Well, yeah, David, I mean, there's quite a few things thrown up by that. I mean, first and foremost, I'm hard pressed to think of a part of the country where Sadiq Khan would win anything outside of London. I find it almost impossible to imagine.
Yeah.
And I also think that when you talk about the most notable person who's made an impact in the campaign being Laurence Fox, who some people would suggest is almost a reincarnated Nigel Farage for the new era. Nigel never went and fought, or certainly not once UKIP was up and running and established. He never went and fought in places that he knew people would utterly detest him, because he had a bit more political savvy and nous than that. Do you think that this is what's going on? Firstly, is it a case of Sadiq Khan just being purely for London and London as being different to the rest of us? And secondly, is it also down to his opposition just not having political nous and experience?
So, I mean, the interesting thing is that Sadiq Khan has 3 legacies from his time as mayor. One is over 380 young people who have died from knife crime, of which he has done nothing about, and seemed to care even less. The other is bankrupting TfL, and the third one was the giant balloon of Donald Trump, which frankly just embarrassed us internationally. I mean, it was just it's astonishing. It's astonishingly bad. But you're right, and Roger's right. London's not unwinnable for a Conservative. But the thing is, though, it does have a different electorate, and it's no accident that 1 in 4 Labour members now are in London. It is very much more a left-wing city. I mean, the Hartlepool result, which I'm sure we'll get onto later, they're going to lose Hartlepool. They're losing the Red Wall, the old Red Wall. I mean, it's becoming a blue wall, let's be honest. And because, exactly as Roger says, because those working class traditional values, getting on, doing the right thing, being patriotic, are no longer Labour values. They're well, I mean, you could argue they're not Conservative Party values, but yeah, but let's they are, at least for some parts of the Conservative Party and the parts which represent that part of the country. But in London, you have a much more woke, much more kind of student-based electorate, much more kind of identity politics fed electorate. But the thing about, and which is why I wish Laurence Fox had a longer run at this, is the key to winning London is to get the donut, as they say, the outer rim of London to vote. If the outer rim of London can be persuaded that the Labour candidate can be defeated, as happened with Boris, then you can defeat the Labour candidate. That's how Ken Livingstone was defeated. And the problem Conservatives have, both small c and the Conservative Party have, is of course most of that outer rim were Remainers, and Brexit of course still looms large over this. I mean, the north of England, the Labour are going to do very badly in, because Brexit's looming large over their Remain support. But in London, of course, London was a Remain city very strongly, even if not necessarily in all parts. I mean, the part I'm in Dagenham was very strongly Leave, but the Conservative vote generally was Remain, and they will vote for Sadiq on that basis. So
Roger, on the basis of that, on the basis of the London electorate being somewhat different to the rest of the country and different issues playing differently, would it be right to suggest that Laurence Fox, David Curtin, Dr. Gammons, all of the patriotic traditional values, freedom rather than authoritarianism type candidates are frankly wasting their time in any London election and going forward from here, and they're better off just leaving it to the establishment of woke, very with it trendy, big state establishment parties, Conservative and Labour, to battle it out, because there's no hope for anyone else?
Well, as somebody might say, leave it to the grown-up politicians. But I think, as we know, Bill, and we know from experience, people stand in elections for a range of different reasons. So many people used to stand in the European elections at the bottom of the list, knowing they had no chance of winning, but they stood because they wanted to develop a CV with their party. They wanted to get their names known, and they hoped that next time round they might do a little bit better. So these people know they're not going to win. Surely they must know they're not going to win, but they've got a platform for a month or two. They've been in the news. Laurence Fox particularly has been in the news. I'm sure he's fairly happy with that. I think that London is potentially winnable for the Conservatives, not this time, but maybe next time, because, I mean, David's absolutely right that Brexit is still a major factor in people's thinking. In 4 or 5 years' time, it will be less a factor. What really counts, I think, is having a larger-than-life personality. With Boris, love him or hate him, he was a larger-than-life personality. So was Ken Livingstone before him. Again, with Shaun Bailey, seems like a nice guy, but he doesn't really have the stature to win for the Conservatives in London, and they're going to have to do better next time.
So it's fair to say, David, then, that I know the mayoral election is perhaps more presidential than what we're used to in this country anyway. But certainly in London, going forward from here, the parties really need to look at having a big personality up front and not worry so much about policy issues and policy debate, but actually more of a focus on presidential style, big personalities, people who get called by their first name, Boris, etc., rather than this more nuanced approach that perhaps used to be employed in our normal domestic elections.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best way to win a big mayoral election, to beat the party machine, certainly, is through big personalities. We've seen it in America. These city region mayoral elections really are largely based on that. I mean, I mean, you could argue that Andy Street is a much more kind of different type of character in West Midlands. Is just somebody who's just got on with the job quietly, and actually, I'm quite a big fan of Andy's in a lot of respect. I think he's done a very good job in that role. But on the whole, to make a breakthrough, I really, especially in London, and just the nature of London, it's this big international global city. It expects big personalities. It expects there's a kind of razzmatazz about it. But when you're mayor of London, you're an international figure. It's not a minor role at all. And I mean, my tip though to speaking as a London voter and why I always do it, I'm not going to say who I'm voting for, although you can probably guess, but is to understand that the final runoff. You get 2 votes for the mayor, and because if one doesn't get 50% in the first round, there's a final runoff between the top 2 candidates. So you understand that the final runoff is almost certainly Labour and the Conservatives. So my tip is to give your first vote to the candidate or party that you wish their issues to be pushed up the agenda, because the more votes they get, the more that. So if you're voting for Laurence Fox or you're voting for Peter Gammons, you're pushing their issues up the agenda. But then to use, if you wish, your second vote to choose between Labour and the Conservatives. That's how I would do it.
A pretty wise bit of advice on tactical voting there. And I think David's nicely segued us, Roger, into the fact that there are elections elsewhere in the country, although you probably wouldn't notice if you're watching the mainstream media. And he does talk about Andy Street there, and that's an interesting one for me. He's my current mayor, and he does have this image of he just quietly gets on with the job. He's a little bit like a political Meghan Markle to me, in as much as Meghan Markle's constantly saying she doesn't want publicity, and yet she's constantly being publicised for saying she doesn't want publicity. Andy Street's constantly saying he's working quietly in the background when there's a great big picture of him working at his desk all over the front of the newspaper. So it's quite a talent that he's got there. But it looks, certainly from on the ground here, it looks like the Conservatives, in the form of Andy Street, are going to retain the mayoralty of the West Midlands, despite a pretty hard and concerted effort from former government minister Liam Byrne and Labour, and not in a classically Conservative area overall. What does that tell us, Roger? I mean, you're a man who knows the Midlands well. What does this tell us, really? The fact that London can be Labour through and through, and yet the West Midlands becomes Conservative through and through.
Well, this is the bizarre issue that I was referring to earlier on. That London, which you expect to be Conservative, now seems to be woke and left-wing, and the red wall seats of the North, but also to an extent the Midlands, are going the other way, which is how Andy Street, I guess, got in there in the first place. Now I'm in the East Midlands, not the West Midlands, so I don't see the local press that he appears in. But from what I've heard, he just seems to be doing could be a party political broadcast, I guess, for Andy Street, but he seems to be getting on with the job, doing the right things, making the economy work as well as it can reasonably be expected to work. At least he's seen like that. You may well take a different view, Bill. I'd be interested to hear what you think, but I think that's the case, and I'm confidently expecting that he will win.
Well, of course, Roger, I'm always relentlessly impartial, so I won't make any further comment other than to say I think it's going to be probably Andy Street. David, your view on Andy Street, and then take us further north, because I know you've got some views on some of the mayoral elections going on further north in the country as well.
So, I think Andy Street is doing well because, for 2 reasons. Because of a change in voting behaviour that Roger's described very well. And, it's interesting, in 2019, just a little statistic for you, the Black Country, 10 out of 13 of the Black Country parliamentary seats went to the Conservative Party. Now, this is... you wouldn't know it from my accent, but this is actually very close to my heart because my family all come from a Black Country, and
good man.
You
I'm
know,
pleased to hear is
Wolves supporters and all the rest of it, you know, and we're, you know, I knew you'd like that, but but you know, it always talked about it being the bellwether part of the country, and the, you know, and for a long time it was Labour, 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 and it seems to have switched, and I don't see Labour winning it back at all, and but the thing that Andy also has is that he's actually got a record now of delivering stuff. I mean, he's, you know, the Longbridge redevelopment, the extension of the metro out to places like Dudley and things like that, the creation of jobs. I mean, these are things, none of these sorts of things Sadiq could ever point to because he's never done anything like that. But you know, at least Andy Street can actually say, well, look, well, in fact, he did in an interview to me, I should say 2 weeks ago. But you know, at least we've done that, and we're, you know, I've got a plan to bring in another 100,000 jobs, and you can see it's believable because he's done what he said he would do in the past. You know, whether he does deliver is another question. But then we move up to Teesside, and I think actually the real star of regional government is, for me, is Ben Houchen in Teesside, Conservative mayor in Teesside, who came in a few years ago on a manifesto, which most unconservative manifesto, which was to take into public ownership the airport. And you know, it's I mean, we always think of them as privatisation, but basically it was to stop the airport from being turned into a housing estate and to use it as a platform for for regenerating the region, which he has done extremely successfully. I mean, they've got a big free port coming there now. They've got major European firms relocating there despite Brexit, you know, and all the rest of it, you know. And it's you know, and he's used his role extremely well to really kind of turn that region around. And again, you see it reflected in the parliamentary seats. You know, they used to have one seat up there, Hexham, and now they've got I think they've got most of the seats in that part of the world. And it's so you know, it kind of shows that, you know, these devolution roles can be extremely successful with people who are willing to do the job properly. And in most cases, you know, you kind of hope that those people will be rewarded. So, you know, but it's certainly an interesting change in the country.
Yeah, well, I mean, it is interesting. And before I come to Roger, for us to go even further north and our journey across the country, I think you mentioned the Black Country, an area that I've been involved with elections for the last decade, and one of the big differences that blue wave of conservative thinking, with a little bit of UKIP in there as well and various other things, was happening for some time, but there was a major factor that was holding it back, and they were called Tom Watson and Ian Austin, who ran absolutely relentless on the ground campaigning, almost like little armies, and they were holding back that tide. Now that they're not on the scene, I think we're seeing the true picture, and I think that, you know, it's interesting to see that a couple of very good generals on the ground can make a difference, but when that's removed, the trend takes over.
Yeah.
So, Roger, we're going further northwards, and we speak about generals on the ground, and we've got a little tin pot dictator up in Scotland whose party is standing and looking like they're going to have a poor result by their own standards. But as with most one-party states, it looks like even if they don't do very well, they're going to remain in power. So the wonderful Nicola Sturgeon and her fantastic cohort of highly democratic and not in any way dubious Scottish nationalists. How do you feel it's gone for them, this campaign?
Can I just put in a comment? As we fly over the northeast on our way to Scotland, I started my career in 1965, so help me, with Procter & Gamble in Newcastle on Tyne. So I have a little bit of exposure to the northeast, and I just want to express my astonishment that Teesside should be going as David is telling it's going. He knows obviously a great deal more about it than I do. But when I was there, I remember it as being incontrovertibly Labour across the whole area, and the change is extremely striking. Coming to Scotland, what can one say about Scotland? And I will say that I am an instinctive unionist because I just think Britain is the Britain I was born in. I quite like it to stay like that, and I think that in economic terms, it's terribly important for Scotland to remain part of the United Kingdom. It's actually fairly important, I think, for England and Wales and Northern Ireland that the United Kingdom should remain in one piece. I've been following this wonderful story of Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon. The Great Battle of the Fishes, as I said right at the beginning, it's very clear that Sturgeon is not delivering. You can list the areas, as I think I did, where she's conspicuously failing. She's making promises, and her party is making promises that are transparently wrong. They come along and say that a hard border between Scotland and England will create jobs. Well, absolute nonsense. It's not just a little bit wrong. It's dramatically and diametrically wrong. And the economic damage that would ensue from Scottish independence is enormous. I love it when people say to me, and particularly when I was an active elected politician, people would say, well, you're opposed to Scottish independence from Britain, but you're in favour of United Kingdom independence from Europe. How do you square that one? To which my answer was, if you understand why it's good for Britain to leave the European Union, you will certainly understand why it's good for Scotland to remain part of the United Kingdom, because the economics look exactly like that, and because Britain is large enough, for example, to have a very successful international currency, and Scotland is not large enough to have, and not well connected enough in the world to have a successful international currency. And one just has to pray that the majority of Scottish voters will sooner or later, and it won't be this year, I suspect, will sooner or later realize the genuine economic damage that Scottish independence would cause. I was very struck by the way that the Royal Bank of Scotland, just days before the election, came up with this proposition that if Scotland became independent, they would move their headquarters to London. Now, I know it's arguably just a sort of brass plate deal. It isn't necessarily closing the office in Scotland and moving it to London. But nonetheless, it was, I thought, a very well-timed tactical intervention. The fact is that the SNP will either win a majority or they will come reasonably close to winning a majority. And in that event, it does seem quite likely, I think, that the Greens, although they'll be a small party, the Greens will do well enough so that if you add together the Scottish nationalists plus the Greens, who are both pro-independence, there will be probably a majority for independence. Now, or a majority for parties that support independence. Of course, because this is a parliamentary election in Scotland, you cannot really say, although Sturgeon will, that the Scottish people have voted for independence. People vote for many different issues. And there are certainly going to be Scottish voters who vote SNP for one reason or another, like that they quite like Nicola Sturgeon, who may not be absolutely committed themselves to Scottish independence. But that's a sort of semantic debate, if you like. And certainly Sturgeon will make hay of a pro-independence majority. And the fascinating question, of course, is exactly how Westminster will react. Now, Boris has been fairly clear about what he intends to do, or what he says at this stage that he intends to do. I'm still cogitating on whether I think his decision is necessarily wise. But I think the good thing is that even Sturgeon says she doesn't want a second referendum at least for, I think it's 2 or 3 years. And I think the move we've seen over recent weeks in the opinion polls, with a bit of a slip for Scottish independence and perhaps a bit of a slip for the SNP, if that is starting a trend, then in 2 or 3 years' time, we may well find either that there is no Scottish independence referendum, or that if there is one, the Unionists win.
Yeah, and I must admit I was quite tickled about the idea of a hard border. Just think if they were going to do up Hadrian's Wall or something like that, and put some turrets on the top with guards and so on. But I mean, there's a load of stuff there that's been opened up, David, by Roger
Yeah,
in his typically very very detailed and thought through
yeah,
response there. And you mentioned before about in London you've got to be a big personality to win. Now in Scotland, the politicians on the scene in Scotland talk about big personalities. Alex Salmond creating his
mm,
own movement. Nicola Sturgeon is hardly shy. George Galloway on the
yeah.
scene. There are so many huge personalities there, and the SNP seem to be being buffeted a little bit in the storm, but they're going to win still. But do you concur with Roger's assessment that this will keep them in power, but it'll be a while before they try for independence again?
So before I joined the Express, I spent 8 years with a Scotsman, both in the Scottish Parliament and then latterly down here in Westminster. I went through the Scottish referendum, which is the most poisonous political event I've ever experienced. And the Scottish nationalists like to describe it as a great celebration of democracy. They went around, their supporters at least, went around intimidating people and threatening people and permanently poisoned the well of democracy in that part of the United Kingdom. And certainly, I left well before, but I had my windows smashed 9 times when I was a journalist in Edinburgh, political journalist in Edinburgh, and death threats and all the rest of it. So it's a snake pit. Scottish politics is. There's no other way to put it, and I personally believe that Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon are directly responsible for that. They're both big personalities, extremely capable politicians. I mean, they're on a par with people like Nigel in terms of their capabilities. Nigel Farage, I should say, in terms of their capabilities and their charisma and so forth. But in the end, we have in Scotland, and I'm not going to apologise for saying this, we have an incompetent, corrupt government in Scotland, and there's no other way to look at it. On incompetence, they are completely in control of education. Now, Scottish education, mass education, was invented in Scotland, and it used to be the best in the world. And for a long time, it was still the best in Britain. Under devolution and under the SNP, it is now the 3rd best in Britain. English, as of 2 or 3 years ago, English results with less money per head was above those in Scotland. Northern Ireland was even further above. Only Wales was below. And that'd be an interesting one to get onto later. In terms of health outcomes, their health outcomes are worse. They have the worst drugs death rate in Europe, and yet they just ignore all this because of the pursuit of the whole of Scottish politics is around this pursuit of independence and constitutional questions. And I'm afraid, speaking as a former political journalist up there, and I was as guilty of it as any, is that the conversation and the articles always went to that subject and never went to the stuff that was actually really impacting people's lives. And this is what fuels the SNP. And in Scotland, you're either for independence or for the union. And that's the unionist parties generally are divided, between Labour and the Conservatives and the Lib Dems to a certain extent. So the SNP always come through with their friends, the Greens, who are these days little more than an offshoot of the SNP with a different colour logo. They're more interested in independence than they are in climate change up in Scotland, and it's quite a depressing circumstance. I think people are beginning to wake up to it, though. Certainly the recent polls show that more people want to stay in the UK than want to leave it now in Scotland, and there's now been a run of polls in that respect. And I think the whole business, I don't want to get into the details because there's still legal issues about it, but that the trial of Alex Salmond and the aftermath of it and the cover-ups by the Scottish government. Really, Nicola Sturgeon's personal responsibility around that, and Alex Salmond's personal responsibility around that, has begun to wake people up to the fact that these are not very nice people. These are not very good people, and they're not very accountable people either. And so, at some point, not this election, but some point soon, I think the skids are going to come on them. And once that happens, they will drop like a stone, just like Scottish Labour did. Scottish Labour, I remember when it happened. I mean, I remember that. I'm trying to think. 2015 election, was it? I remember watching the complete collapse. These these massive majorities that Labour had in these seats, and they were all wiped out bar one. And and it can happen. And the Scottish electorate is as volatile as any. So, if I'm Boris, even if there's a pro-independence majority, I say, look, you had your once-in-a-generation referendum, tough. That's it. You've got to wait and just get on with fixing the problems in your country. We've got a pandemic to recover from. Thank you very much. And just get on with it.
Well, on the cheery note of the potential future demise of the SNP and their collapse, which has made me smile a bit more than the earlier discussions about Scotland. Let's finish our tour round before we speak about the future, because there's a humdinger of a fight going on in Wales. And in Wales, we've got some real notables standing. We've got the Abolish the Senedd Party, or Abolish, I think they're just known as, who seem to be making some pretty strong moves there, and they're made up quite a lot of ex-UKIP activists in there, actually, from what I can see. You've got UKIP itself still fighting strong in there, with the party leader, Neil Hamilton, in there fighting for a seat. You've got Reform Party, previously known as Brexit Party, and next week who knows what it's known as, but that party in there as well. You've got the battle between Labour and the Conservatives, plus Welsh separatists, and all sorts going on there. Roger, it's a right old mixing pot of really tough campaigners in Wales. Any thoughts? Can you clear up the confusion for us? Who do you think is going to come out in top in Wales?
I'm sorry, I don't really think I should give an opinion on that, because I haven't been following Wales perhaps as closely as I ought to. But you're right. It looks a bit like a snake pit. I'm interested to see that it's the sort of last stand of UKIP in a way, isn't it? Because I don't think UKIP's going to get any votes anywhere except possibly in Wales. And from what I see on social media and so on, Neil Hamilton seems to be making waves and gaining some awareness. So I'll be fascinated to see how he gets on. But my overall comment would be, isn't this an impressive endorsement of the idea of devolution? Wasn't it a wonderful idea? Look where we've got to in Scotland. Look where we've got to in Wales. And can anybody really think that it was a smart way of doing things? I'm sure there was a case for local decision-making on a range of issues, but to present it as creating a Scottish Parliament and a Welsh, what do they call it? Senate? Yes.
Senate.
Yes. I mean, it's just fed the idea of national antipathies within the United Kingdom and had exactly the reverse effect. Effect that was predicted for it. It was Tony Blair, wasn't it, who said, well, we need to have devolution because it'll spike the guns of these separatists and they won't be able to get into separation. Actually, what it's done is to hypercharge them. And how we recover from that is a difficult question, except I'm encouraged by what David is saying about the SNP in Scotland, and he's right, of course, the opinion polls are looking as though they may just come to a turning point. So pray God that's the case, and maybe that will become the case in Wales as well.
Well, I tend to believe that the answer to most questions as to why something has gone badly wrong is it was Tony Blair, wasn't it? I think that you've answered the question to virtually everything there, Roger. And the idea of Neil Hamilton causing waves, well, I find that hard to believe. David, can you make any more sense of what's happening in Wales? Are you going to be able to be bold enough to jump forward and tell us who's going to win and what's going to happen?
Well, I would say Labour are favourites just about to be the biggest party, but the interesting thing is that the Conservatives may be the biggest party, which would be an astonishingly good result for them, given that the demographics really are still very much against them there, and how long Labour have been in control. But this comes down to the fact that Labour, whatever Welsh government, I'm not sure, Welsh whatever, has been a disaster. And Drakeford, out of a crowded field of pretty bad leadership in this country and around the world on the pandemic, has stood out as being one of the worst. I mean, I don't think I'll ever forget the story about what you can and cannot buy in a supermarket. I mean, it was mind-boggling, and of course, a lot of these red wall seats are in Wales as well. So North Wales is going Conservative, interestingly enough, and parts of South Wales. So things maybe are shifting there. Even if the Conservatives come first, while Labour and Plaid Cymru will probably get together and form a coalition there, which would be the worst possible outcome for Wales, actually, but never mind. The interesting thing is that the Lib Dems look as though they're going to disappear altogether from Wales. I mean, I think it was Lloyd George famously said that the Liberals were the party of the Celtic fringes, later in his career, and they're not even that anymore. So it's they got one seat going into this election, and she's stepping down, and that seat looks as though it's going to go Conservative. So it's it'll be interesting to see if they abolish the Assembly Party, get any seats. There were some polls suggesting they might, which would be a good thing. I think that devolution needs to be challenged. I mean, I spoke earlier about Andy Street and Ben Houchin in the West Midlands and Teesside have shown how devolution can be a good thing, and how they can and how you can actually make real progress. But unfortunately, the vast majority of devolution has been a failure in Scotland and Wales in particular. Education standard, education results, which is the most important thing really that these guys are in charge of, have gone down and have suffered during the period of devolution. Health outcomes have failed. I mean, it's the SNP. Sorry, going back to Scotland briefly, the SNP literally rewrote their targets to have less stringent targets, and still failed in the health outcomes. And the same similar things happened in Wales with Labour, and it's just so it's about time that parties are, and I think Neil Hamilton with UKIP is also challenging it, but it's about time there is some sort of challenge to this, saying, do we want this layer of government? Do we want to pay for this? Is it doing us any good? Are the outcomes any good? Because the interesting prediction I will make, and it will be a long time before we maybe come back onto some sort of virtual platform, but in about 20 years' time, if the current trajectory goes, and assuming Wales and Scotland stay part of the UK, the current trajectory of outcomes go on education and health, on crime and so forth, then there will be a clamour to get rid of these bodies, because they are not working. And with the Labour mayors, Manchester with Burnham, I've forgotten Steve Rotherham in Liverpool, and of course Sadiq in London. All these guys are interested in is potentially becoming Labour leader, and using their region or city regions as a platform for national politics and for their own egos. They're not at all interested. They're not done anything. They haven't achieved anything for the people who voted for them in. And in fact, the interesting. I'll finish off with this, but the interesting thing about Thursday's results is if the Conservatives win Hartlepool, and if Labour have a bad night generally, and Sadiq walks in easily in London, watch the push for Sadiq to replace Keir Starmer as leader.
That is horrifying.
It is.
That's worth a programme on its own.
Yeah, I mean, but it's already been talked about. That's what Sadiq wants, I believe. I mean, I haven't spoken to him personally, obviously, but that's what I'm told he wants. That's what a lot of people are looking for. They think that he could be the bridge candidate between the Corbynistas and, the sane people, and he would be the one with a big electoral mandate.
I'm pretty sure that it's not just what some Labour people want. I'm convinced it's what Boris Johnson wants as well.
Oh, yeah.
I think he could stay in Downing Street for the rest of his life.
Make everybody happy.
Yeah, absolutely. Vote Sadiq. I'll put any Labour members out there. I want to say right now, I back Sadiq Khan to be the Labour leader. I think it's a great idea. And maybe get Ken Livingstone as his deputy. That would be great. We'll move on slightly because we've covered our ground. We've been from London through Hartlepool, through the North, the Midlands, Scotland, Wales. We've covered what's happening, but I think it's important to discuss where we go from here, because most of the big wins that we're talking about outside of Scotland are really coming down to Conservative or Labour again, as it always used to be, with a brief period, an intermission where the Lib Dems at one point, UKIP at another point. We're starting to mix it up a little bit. It's going back, it would appear, to those two big parties. And I'll start with Roger by saying, first and foremost, is it not the case now, perhaps more than ever, that there is no real difference between those parties? And possibly, I would suggest that politics in future will need to split more between freedom as opposed to statism, rather than right against left. And if that's the case, those two parties are both on the side of statism now. And if we agree with that, how do the insurgent parties change the electoral map?
Well, I think you're right, very much in terms of it not so much being left and right. Probably right, I'm afraid, in terms of individual freedom versus state control, and it is, at least in that aspect, looking very much as though Conservatives and Labour are both converging on approving state control. Now, let's be clear, they will do different things with state control. But the idea of state control, one of the saddest things about this whole pandemic has been the way that, according to the opinion polls, the British people, instead of champing at the bit and saying we demand freedom, are actually saying, no, we like being told what to do with the government. And in fact, the government should be a bit harsher on us and beat us a little bit more. And that is a tragic outcome. I'm not sure I accept your analysis, Bill, that we're going to end up with the two old parties, if you like, Conservative and Labour. Because I think Labour is facing, and this goes back to some of the things we said earlier on, Labour is facing a critical problem. It can hold London by being left-wing and woke. It cannot recover itself in the red wall constituencies in the North and the Midlands by doing that. Indeed, it needs to do the opposite in those seats and those areas. It needs to be socially conservative. It needs to make clear its support for Britain and for Brexit. And it can't do both. I can't see how even the Labour Party can present itself as a woke left-wing party in London and as a conservative, patriotic right-wing party in the north of England. So I would possibly see an outcome where the Conservative Party stays in a dominant position or a strong position, leaving a kind of maelstrom of a declining Labour Party and lots of insurgent parties on the other side, as it were. And who knows who will come out of those insurgent parties. It's difficult to see any one at the moment that is way ahead of any other. I'm not sure that Nigel was right to change the name of his Brexit party to Reform. I can see why he wanted to do that, because obviously if you've got Brexit, how do you go on being a Brexit party? But he's lost the effective branding that he had. And I saw on social media today a comment that really struck me. that the Reform Party and Leave UK are talking about ending lockdown as a sort of major campaigning theme, but actually lockdown is just ending. So you're losing twice. You're losing first because opinion polls seem to suggest the British people are not that keen on the issue anyway. But even if they're keen on the issue, it's being delivered or likely to be delivered. I know there are all sorts of caveats. Will it really happen? So I don't quite see where that's going. But something will emerge. There will always be an opposition. I'm just not sure who it'll be in 5 years' time.
Well, yeah, so it's an interesting proposition, David. We're looking at a almost eternal Conservative government, but a Conservative Party wedded to the big state and authoritarianism, and locked in a sadomasochistic relationship with the British public where it beats them into submission on a regular basis and they like it. Is that the way it's going to go?
I don't agree. I don't agree. What I would say is that there is a huge battle going on behind the scenes in the Conservative Party, which people don't necessarily focus on because they prefer to focus on Boris's wallpaper issues. But it's, but you know, I think the trajectory of the Conservative Party is pro-freedom, anti-woke, getting itself in the really in the culture wars. And if you look at the people coming through in the new areas, in the red wall seats we talked about, this is where the Conservative Party growth is. And if you look at things like the Common Sense group, the blue collar conservative group, you know, which account for, 60 MPs in the Common Sense group, 120, I think, in the blue collar. These are people of the right, low tax, pro freedom, anti woke, and we're seeing it feed through. And there's certainly no. There's quite a divide really with the Labour Party because the Labour Party has gone the other way. The Labour Party has basically taken the knee, as they say these days, you know, and it's and which is part of its problem. Now we have had lockdown, and clearly that I think has because the two parties have converged, the leaderships of the two parties have converged on that, but the Conservative membership and a lot of Conservative backbenchers have been very much anti-lockdown and much more in tune with that side of things. And I'm not sure we should take the exceptional circumstances of the pandemic as a general rule for what the Conservative Party will be going forward. Now, I may be wrong. I hope I'm not wrong, but I may be wrong. But I think at least with people like Boris and kind of a lot of the MPs there, the push will be to move away from these restrictions if a little too slowly, well, a lot too slowly in my view, but it will be away. Whereas if we have the Labour Party, I mean, God, imagine if Jeremy Corbyn had won that election. You know, we'd be talking about these things becoming permanent.
Well, yeah, I want to play with this a little bit for the last couple of minutes, David, because you've opened up an interesting thing. We've got a couple of minutes more to play. I mean, and I'm going to put in the proposition that imagine if Jeremy Corbyn had won that election, we'd have massive spending off the scale. We'd have state control and ownership. We'd have huge debt with the Bank of England having to buy up government bonds. In fact, we'd be where we are now. Now, I want to put it. I'm going to give you a chance to come back because I've had a little dig at you there. So I'm going to give you a chance to come back in a minute. But I want Roger, first of all, most of my life, I was a Conservative supporter and I was briefly a member of the Conservative Party. And during that time, I was always told, as David said rightly there, and it is always the case, there's groups of people trying to take the party back to the right. There are Thatcherites working away in the background. And we had the Freedom Association, we had the Bruce Group, we had other organisations. I remember, you know, I'll drop a name, speaking to my hero, Lord Tebbit, about these things when I was a Conservative. And it's always been the case that there's this effort to push the party to the right, and we're going to get there. And it never, ever happens. They, in fact, drift to the economic left and the authoritarian big state extremes. And I think the pandemic, yes, can be used as an explanation, but they seem a little bit too enthusiastic about it for my liking. They seem to enjoy it too much. Am I being unfair, Roger, or am I seeing this through the opposite of rose-tinted spectacles, or do you see some sense in what I say there?
Well, we've spent too long perhaps losing some of the arguments to see that we might have the potential for winning some of them. I'm very encouraged by David's analysis, and he makes some important points, and I hope he's right, just as he hopes he's right. It would be wonderful to see a genuine free market, Jeffersonian principles, Conservative Party, low taxes, limited government, personal freedom, all those things. Indeed, that's what I thought the Conservative Party was when I was elected 3 times as a Conservative MEP. And it was only when I was finally convinced that might be in the back of their minds, but it wasn't what they were doing now, especially in relation to Europe, that I finally had to sever my ties with the Conservative Party. Can I just throw in a personal line, though? You mentioned your hero, Norman Tebbit. I don't know if you've read his book about game cookery, but out in the kitchen at the moment, I have a haunch of venison marinating according to Norman Tebbit's recipe, and I look forward very much to eating it tomorrow.
Well, that's if Lord Tebbit put it forward, I think it's going to taste very spicy and tasty. It's going to be very mature, and it's going to pack a punch. David, is it the case then? I mean, I was trying to create before a proposition where insurgent parties would shake things up, but am I reading it right that you think actually what might happen is the real opposition towards the Conservative current government is actually within the Conservative Party, and that these are the guys who will bring about the change that certainly I would like to see, and that they will be more effective and pack a more powerful punch than the Eurosceptics did for all those years when they were sidelined?
No. The interesting thing is, I do think that there is a powerful punch within an opposition within the Conservative. I mean, let's be honest. In Parliament, the only opposition to lockdown has come from Conservative MPs. You know, with the honourable exception of DUP MPs, but largely we're talking about Conservative MPs. The interesting thing will be who takes over after Boris. I think Boris has shown himself to be too statist in the end. He's a Cameroon, really. You'd hate to be described as such, but that's what he is. He's a David Cameron type Conservative, really, with more charisma.
And I had my money on Liz Truss for that. But then, did you hear the interview that she did with Julia Hartley-Brewer earlier in the week?
Yes, I did. I mean, Liz is funny. I mean, she used to be chair of a Liberal Party at Oxford or something like that. I mean, it was she's tried to be more of a kind of Conservative lately to get support. I don't think she's going to. I mean, watch Priti Patel. Interestingly enough, despite all her problems, the Conservatives are rallying to her. Interestingly enough, at the moment, I mean, these things change, but I do think there's an important role for the successors of UKIP and the Brexit Party, Reclaim, Laurence Fox's party, Richard Tice of the Reform Party, UKIP if it continues. They've got to hold the Conservative Party's feet to the fire, and make sure that they stick to the right and go for those Jeffersonian principles that Roger described. That's because otherwise they'll drift to the centre. And it was only really, in the end, it was only thanks to UKIP that we had the referendum. But with the referendum. With Brexit has changed everything because the European Union was the enormous millstone tied around our neck, which pulled us into a corporatist centre, corporatist centrism for both Labour and the Conservatives. With that, now that they are free of that and responsible really for their own policies again in Parliament and things like that, I think we'll see a drifting to the left and the right of both parties, and maybe I'm over optimistic, but I think there are I see reasons for optimism in the parliamentary party.
Maybe I'm too miserable. It wouldn't be the first time someone had said it, David. So there's every chance it could be that. Final thoughts for both of you, because we're coming to the end of our time, and Roger's made me feel hungry by talking about his cookery. Just focusing really. All right, let's take it as a given. There's internal opposition within the Conservative Party, but as David rightly pointed out, I think it needs external opposition to be forcing the centre of gravity to the right as well. And we've mentioned Laurence Fox and his party. We've mentioned UKIP. We've mentioned that notable man of the people, Richard Tice, and his group of pals. And there are other people out there who are, actually people I do have respect for, like David Curtin and his organisation. And there are others out there, other parties, John Rhys Evans, lots and lots of parties out there, which are broadly speaking, pro-free speech, anti-woke, free market, free people, the very thing that we all, I think, want the Conservatives to be, and they need forcing down that route. Roger, is it possible under the current circumstances that these guys are going to fight it out and the cream will rise to the top and one person will become the new Nigel Farage and the new UKIP, or do they need to bury the hatchet and come together as a broad church and work together?
Well, I'd love to see genuine Conservatives within the Conservative Party starting to deliver. And if right at this late moment of our debate, I can introduce my pet hobby horse. One of the things that scares me about Boris is his commitment to the climate change agenda and net zero. I love Charles Moore's quotation where he said he feels the chill hand of net zero on the windpipe of Western economies. We are damaging ourselves hugely in this respect. I was impressed to find over the last, really almost the last few days, a bit of a fight back from industry. It's about time industry was saying, look, we can't cope with this. At the moment, they've all been falling over themselves to say, oh, look how green we're being. And they're not making the case for sensible economic and energy policies. And if Boris goes down that route, then he will not be the leader to take us to the broad sunlit uplands of a sensible Conservative Party.
Well, David, resisting the temptation to join Roger on the Green Crusade, because believe you me, when we get Roger going on this, it'll be brilliant, but we'll be here until past midnight. And I think that perhaps we none of us can go that long, although I do enjoy hearing Roger on this particular subject, and I completely concur. To the question in hand, liberty, freedom, right of centre politics, unashamed patriotism, conservative, perhaps more libertarian values. We have this wide range of field of all these smaller parties jousting it out with big characters, big egos. Is one going to rise to the surface, or do they need to try and work together?
Well, I'm going to make a small confession here. I tried, not very hard, but a little bit, to have a united small c Conservative candidate for the London Mayoral election. I encouraged various candidates to talk to one another to try and, instead of splitting the vote and giving this plethora of, and really just to kind of, whether it was Laurence Fox or Peter Gammons or something like that, or David Curtin, excellent chap. They needed really one thing, because they're all saying largely the same thing. They all stand for largely the same thing. And frankly, going forward, that's what needs to happen. We can't have a Reclaim Party and a Reform Party and UKIP and all the rest of it. We need these. Even the Abolish the Assembly Party, with, as you quite rightly say, is mostly made up of former UKIP members. These people all need to come together and really become the voice for, be in some ways the new UKIP for the culture war age. That's what they need to be, to fight for freedom and to really scare the living daylights out of the Conservative Party from ever abandoning the principles of freedom, low tax, and standing up for our traditions and culture. And that's what needs to happen.
Yeah.
Amen to that. I think that is an excellent note for us to finish on. I think, David, you've summed up the feelings of the meeting very, very nicely there. We've slightly overrun our time, but it's been worth it because it's been excellent again, gentlemen. So thank you. So all that remains for me to say is to thank Roger Helmer. Thank you so much for your time, sir. Always been a pleasure. And David, thanks for the input. It's been great again. Really, really enjoyed having you on. Everyone out there, if you've enjoyed the show tonight, please, if you're a regular viewer, you know the drill by now. Share it round, tell your friends, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Let's get the message out there. Let's get people speaking. And if you're a politician out there who believes in liberty, freedom, and right of sense of values, listen to what David just said. I think it might be food for thought. On that note, I wish you all a very good evening.
Good night.
Good night.